Hi, Brian. How are you doing?
Abhishek, I'm very good. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for joining us from Ireland. You are literally my first international guest. I'm so glad
Oh,
to have
really?
you. Yes, yes.
Oh, the,
I mean, I
the
did one
pressure
with
is
my
on.
neighbor, but she lives like 2 floors above me. She was in India, so we can count as international and not international. But in all twists, since your first international guest.
I feel privileged. You're putting me under pressure now. I have to honor this, but thank you. And I'm, by the way, thank you for inviting me to this. I checked out some of them earlier, really interesting conversations. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
Likewise, Brian. So glad to have you. We've been chatting for a while, and I've learned so much from you how enterprises operate. And I think it's like a perspective I really wanted to have you over. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation. And you've been working in IT industry for over 25 years as an executive. You've built high performing teams. You've worked across infrastructure, application strategic planning, and your experience like some massive companies, right? NetApp, you spent a decade at VMware, and you basically pretty much lead the CTO services, all of island operations. Like that's a very big responsibility. How did you manage that, and do you like it?
Well, actually, it was almost 18 years at VMware. But who's counting? I think I'm very privileged because somebody told me recently, you're not going to get 10 plus careers anywhere anymore because it's coming into this kind of gig economy and, you know, solopreneur economy. So I was very privileged to have that experience. But yeah, I think there's a huge enterprise opportunity in AI today. And I know you wanted to touch on that. And I think as well, it's true to say that enterprise environments are slightly different, obviously, to consumer or startup environments. Okay. So while the opportunity is huge, I think it's always tempered, in my experience, in my years with these companies, with risk mitigation, right? So, like you are, and that's correct if you think about it, because you're answerable to the board of directors, to your shareholders. If you happen to operate in a regulated environment, the compliance stakes are higher, and oftentimes that can be a barrier to rapid innovation. Okay, but I think I would also say, like, for the benefit of our chat today, a bigger risk actually is not to adopt AI. And I think it's a risk of missing out, if that makes sense, missing your competitive advantage. And that window is closing fast. So you have to balance this risk with moving quite quickly, right? So when was GPT released? 2022, is that right?
I
I think
think
that
so.
was.
Yeah. Yeah.
It seems like a lifetime ago now.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know about you, Abhishek, but I remember being in kind of all hands meetings or going and listening to other companies' quarterly reports. Okay, and it seemed like caught the world by surprise, especially like every C-suite executive in Silicon Valley. It's almost like they got into a room and said, "How are we going to handle this? How are we going to press the pause button?" I heard over and over again, leaders talk about embedding AI, looking at it in product, customer, and operations. In many senses, that's the way business leaders shape strategy anyway, like always through product, customer, and operations. And getting those outcomes defined well is the job of the leader, and then mapping the technologies to those outcomes. That's not changed in the world of AI. But I think the scientifically blunt thing that often people answer your question with is AI is just going to automate everything, right? I don't know what you mean by that. It's going to make much better efficiencies, right? Reduce human error. It's going to, improve our costs. It's going to reduce the workforce and so on. And I've often scratched my head at that and said, well, hang on a second. What IT has been automating stuff for 20 years. And half that time, if I'm right, AI and ML has been around. I remember doing a ticket deflection with data scientists in VMware in 2016. So why is it different this time around? And there's a couple of things, right, that you and I have spoken about offline. Firstly, this isn't software automation like you're used to. This is intelligence. And that requires a different mindset and a different kind of preparation, collaboration. which we're going to get into today. But the other thing that only kind of struck me yesterday when I was thinking about this conversation is that, okay, we've been doing automation for 20 years. That's true. But you always had to talk to a team, like a human middleware, if you like, right, of a data scientist, maybe a developer, a leader, and they might ask you, Abhishek, to fill out a BRD, a business requirements document. And then they go away and do a proof of concept, and then you'd UAT it. And several iterations later, you may have some kind of piece of automation. Okay. Now, I don't know, I agree that that's democratized. Like the accessibility to this powerful automation is just at people's fingertips today, right?
I'm curious, Brian, as you think about, I mean, you've worked in very, very long time and you're right about automation has always been there, but what kind of automation are we talking about, right? Those are pretty much rules driven automation. And yes, very basic machine learning was there, but it was minimal context in the sense. So you can't, if you look at earlier machine learning models that were even used, they couldn't hold a lot of context. So you couldn't do large training or have a lot of longer context windows. And that has fundamentally changed, right? So now as you think about machine learning from decade ago to machine learning now, and the companies that you have worked at, where do you see the biggest agentic AI opportunities within those organizations? And especially your experience is interesting, Brian. And I think one thing we should think about, you worked at the companies that have been so tech forward. That's not true for all the industries. Like VMware and NetApp were, they're still the leaders in what they do, right?
Yeah, it's a very apt question. I think the power of it now and the opportunity of it now, if you think about time to value, right? The time to value of some of these automations before, like I was trying to allude to, was many weeks to many months, right? That's decreased. And I think the power of the training and these data sets, now the TTV, the problem isn't in the technology or isn't the agents. It's actually rather in the data sets that they're working with or they have access to, if you understand. And I think that's probably the biggest opportunity for enterprises, whether they're modern enterprises like VMware, Dell, Apple, etc., Silicon Valley enterprises, or something that's more complex and legacy. You made an allusion to the start that we're often working in very complex environments. You take one business process could span, multiple apps, multiple microservices, multiple pieces of infrastructure. It can context switch between legacy and non-legacy environments, and there could be a lot of humans in the loop along the way, just for one business process. And some of the best leaders I've worked with have been able to identify business processes that would have had a huge ROI on improving revenue and sales and bottom line for the company. And that's even more true in, let's just say, the non-tech companies than it is the tech companies, right? Which might be slightly ahead of the game. And there's huge opportunities for leaders of those companies listening to embrace agentic AI and just experiment with it. It doesn't actually cost much. It's often not on a license model. Now, we can talk about what you need to prepare for in the governance of that, but I'm definitely in favor of experimenting around the edges.
Yeah. So I think just to summarize, Brian, what you said, we focus on these complex business processes where there will be most ROI. And like before we think about agentic AI, there have been many, many companies, Brian, and I was just looking at yesterday. So Gartner came up with this whole magic quadrant last year for the first time ever. It's called BOAT. It's called Business Orchestration Automation. I'm forgetting what the letter T stands for. And then
That's
I looked at the company.
week to remember.
Yeah, yeah. So it's called BOAT, and this quadrant never existed. So when Gartner comes up with these magic quadrants, it just shows what is the most in demand. Usually Gartner doesn't come up with magic quadrants. What was very interesting that they came up now, and every company was at least 2 decades old. If you look at, I don't know if I have rights to show the copyrighted material here. I would have shared it right now with you. I'll share the link offline. But it was so interesting to see that So I'm wondering, like when you were at VMware and NetApp, what kind of tools you use? Like people did use for business process automation, some of these tools, and what changes now? What is the difference from your perspective as an operator?
Yeah, go back to 2022 when GPT came out, right? Because, like I said, these RPAs, robotic process automations, were always there, and I think the short answer to question is like the tools and the vendors were always leapfrogging each other. So we never had a kind of a long run on any of them, I think, or there was a lot of frustration embedded in the fact that eventually you had to have a human, fill something out or govern it. But I think what was happening in recent years is that like pretty quickly people realized that they wanted to use the benefits of specifically generative AI, but they wanted to license that behind a firewall and then build tooling on top of that. Sometimes that could be as basic as improving the UI interface to your own private model, your foundation model, building prompt libraries, building the ability to interact with data sets and documents and so on. Um, but I think it's still reliant on the underlying automation, and whether that's like automation in cloud, like we use Terraform and Python and all those infrastructure automations on top of regular programming RPAs as well, and a kind of a tangled mesh, if you like, of these tools, and trying to get that to speak to AI, which was basically a large language model foundation model, it initially was quite challenging, right? Until, of course, the rise of agentic AI and that concept, which is a much smaller fleet, and I know you guys are working on that. So, yeah, it was never, in my experience, like a one-stop shop, if that makes sense.
So you had multiple issues, right? So you have these automation tools, but there's still where it came to human handoffs, and those two pieces are not connected. You have approvals, and then you have data translation issues that you still have to map out data, which it's a very interesting. I had this conversation with a friend of mine, Yichin. She's actually building her startup fleet, is actually working on the data translation layer for exactly the problems you described. Like you have multiple data sets and they need to speak to each other. How do you solve for that problem, right? And it becomes very, very interesting. And very interesting, Brian. So, if we go step ahead before we even think about agentic in these large organizations, what do the teams need to understand about their current processes? What's usually missing or broken, like even before we start in this initiative?
Yeah. It's funny, we're talking of preparation, and I think the reality check is that in many cases the horse is already bolted, Abhishek. Like the agents are running amok; they're in the wild, as they're in peace or whatever, and leaders and engineers are figuring out pretty quickly. Hang on a second, there are processes we need to start thinking about that are missing, like you said, like central orchestration. The governance, who's onboarding agents, who's offboarding agents, what's the life cycle of that. Um, there's this kind of shared mindset missing, which is this kind of a shared foundation concept or platform thinking, if you like, or systems thinking about agentic AI right across the enterprise. In addition, a surprising one for you on things that companies should be thinking about, well, maybe not that surprising, is that it's not a technological process, right? It's this workforce conversation that we have to have, and I think leaders have been reluctant to maybe to have it because maybe nobody can predict what's going to happen. But I would say don't wait to predict it. I would say go ahead and invent it in your own company. Start somewhere, right? And you have to start having those conversations. But and in reality, it's okay that the horse is bolted, right? Because it's never too late to run these governance procedures in parallel. And if we're really honest about it, Abhishek, we're playing catch up here, I think.
Yeah, it makes sense, Brian, because I wonder in today's world, having this centralized agentic orchestration is more like a dream because the organization processes are very, very different. And do you wait for the central system and deployment? And all the internal political challenges you have to go through versus each department goes figure it out. And maybe there is a system where when we take the highest ROI business problems, we can start putting it there. But from your perspective, would you want to wait for this perfect central agentic orchestration system?
I think there's confusion out there on the use of the word, for example, platform. Like, so I liken it to where we got to in the world of multi-cloud, for example, where we're actually delivering genuine cloud management platforms. Um, so, is there going to be a development platform internal for enterprises that's going to be the one ring to rule them all, if you like, for AI? And there are companies out there, offering this right now, as you know, Frame, Abacus, etc. So you could build or buy it. I think why it's useful for companies to think about it is, and I think hopefully this will help kind of touch where you're getting to as well, right? Which is you need to move fast, you need to experiment, you need to try stuff, right? The confusion on platform thinking is there's so many point products out there that call themselves platforms, but they're actually just point products for that particular solution. What I mean by platform as systems thinking is that anything you're building is part of a larger whole. So with AI, it's the same systems thinking concept that tools can come and go, right? But I think enterprises should start thinking about it doesn't have to be perfection day one, but they should start thinking about owning the aggregation orchestration layer, either build or buy it themselves, or some tool that they're currently using can maybe fit that bill, right? And experimenting around the edges. Because you do need to think about security or back, who's owning all these agents. At some point in time, you need to start thinking about that for enterprises. It is important, but it doesn't mean you have to be slow on the innovation experimentation piece either. You don't have to wait for that perfection, but sooner or rather later, you're going to be accountable for the agents that are happening and building outcomes for your systems. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, Brian, and I think where you're also going with it. If we take the highest ROI business problems, they're definitely touching multiple departments and multiple people. And thinking about centralization, because most point products are very specific. Let's say I'm an SDR. It's usually not touching many departments, and it's better to get like a very niche product that excels at that, and they have a lot of data from different companies what works really well over there. But when we think about large business processes and organizations, like NetApp, VMware, or I mean even like middle America enterprises, right, where uh, these are cross-functional problems, there are many stakeholders involved. We need to think more centrally about it and not start innovating for those problems in different business units. I mean, that completely makes sense. So one thing as I think about this, Brian, I'm a huge fan of checklists, right? And in world of agents and processes, I've worked on many different problems, and I've run operations team. I think now, between my last startup and at Cisco, like almost coming to 2 decades, running 24/7 operations. And most time I realized that there was not even a paper checklist on what these operations team do. And I read this book a while ago. It's called Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gaikwad. It's like one of the most phenomenal books I've ever read. Have you read that book? But
No, we must, or you must share this in the notes afterwards for people.
yeah. So it's a really fantastic book. It talks about airline industries. It talks about medical industries, how checklists have been phenomenally good. If you think and bring that concept as we go into agentic world, because the cost of error working with intelligence, intelligent automation can be a lot, right? So how do you think about what steps would you take before even you deploy one agent?
Wow. Okay. There's a lot. I think I can lend some thoughts to this question. Really quickly, I'd like to start with the non-technical stuff if I could, right? So not to repeat myself, but you have to have that workforce conversation. I kind of call it the MVP. In your world, you know what an MVP is, Abhishek, for minimal viable product. I'm talking about minimal viable people that are necessary to have this workforce conversation. I don't think it stops at an executive layer. I think the right people at the right place in the right room need to our rooms need to start having these conversations about where are we keeping our human differentiation. And there's lots of examples of that in enterprise IT, for example. I'll give you one really quickly. The Genius Bar concept, the Apple Genius Bar concept, where you go to with your laptop and you get it fixed, and maybe you have a cup of coffee. People love that model, and you're getting technical expertise, but you also have a human interface to that. It's a differentiator for companies. There's lots of other examples, but you have to also be honest about training and transforming current staff to new roles. You have to be honest about roles that are outgoing, they're not going to be here, and roles that are incoming. Okay, let's not be naive either. It's not a democracy where everybody gets a vote to keep their role, but it's rather like a mature conversation that you have now that will pay dividends in the future. So that's one. The second piece to that workforce conversation for me, and this is why I think you need to start of it before, or at least in parallel with the technical checklist you referred to, is where will humans be in the loop in the future, right? So a good analogy, I may have even heard you talking about it on one of your podcasts. I'm not sure, but
We
I
talked
like
about
the
automation in the loop, Brian.
well, it was agents as staff or agents as interns. I think it's useful to start thinking about agents coming into your business as actual workers, or but they're not even interns, right? They're pre-interns. They're in some embryonic state right now. So, Abhishek, what would you do if an intern joined your organization, right? You'd probably mentor them. You'd probably train them. You mightn't let them touch production, code straight away. You'd certainly have some kind of custodian or ownership over that. I think humans in the loop need to do this for the foreseeable future, but they need to do it cleverly. And how do you scale that when there's thousands of agents at play? And they need to use tools to do that, which is why we go back to like some of the orchestration thoughts I had earlier, right? But I think a big learning for me is the DevOps culture mind shift that people started talking about, 10, 15 years ago. You used to get people consulting on this, right? Which were making money on consulting on DevOps. But I used to work for a great leader who once told me, when Microsoft started doing DevOps and didn't want their localization engineers doing testing anymore, they only wanted developers. So they wanted the operators to become developers, but they wanted developers to also experience the pain of the operations their products cause, right? There's a conversation you need to have there. The first one is the operators to developers, there's a technical gap, correct? But the developers to the operators, it's an emotional gap. And that's always the harder one to jump over, would you believe? So, how do you get some of the best people in the organization to start coming into areas like data governance and knowledge management and things that may seem boring to them, right? Because that's something you need to think about in the workforce. The third piece in the workforce is try not have a siloed approach. Please. You really need an enterprise-wide approach to this. I know like sales and HR and finance are, they probably have a Replit subscription and are, testing out products and mobile apps, and they want to move fast and they get frustrated. And I think enterprise leaders are under pressure to move as fast as that. But the sooner you have some kind of common practice in your organization that has that shared mindset belief around AI, the better. But you did ask me about the tech checklist. Okay, and please interrupt me if you want me to dive deeper.
I wanted to have overall checklist, Brian. I think, you touched it actually more correctly. It's actually the process part of it before even we touch the tech, right? So I think you covered most of them, but is there anything on the people side or the processes side of things that you would actually do? Because tech, that's like sort of relatively easy.
I think, yes. I think the main things for me are around data architecture, data governance, I would say on top of that as well, knowledge management. I think knowledge management, which I do want to talk about with you today, is the jewel in the crown for AI ops, by the way. Um, Probably if we have time, we can touch on observability as well. Security is a big one, but let's start with data architecture. Obviously, at NetApp, it was a data intelligence infrastructure company, and it's right and proper that organizations do have very modern data architecture where they have centralized control no matter what your data type is. You try and architect it so your data is close to your AI compute processing. The cost of vectorization is minimized. These are conversations at an architecture level you need to be having. But I think the stronger points which I want to focus on is the data governance and knowledge management piece. So really, really quickly and briefly, think about data governance as cleaning your house, right? You start from top to bottom. You start taking on piles and what you're going to throw out that's really old. You what you're going to keep or you're not going to donate. You have to classify. So in data governance, that's like what's top secret and confidential down to what's private and public. And you train organizations on this, by the way, and that needs to be fairly good. So the same rule sets should apply to what the agents have access to as well, right? In that governance model. But the jewel in the crown piece, I think, and I don't actually think, Abhishek, enough people are talking about this. And if I was talking to any enterprise, I would say this is what you need to focus on now, is actually a really, really old school thing, right? Which is knowledge management. And last week, let me tell you a quick story. I called up an old colleague of mine, Darcy, and she might be listening back to this. Hi, Darcy, because she used to run policy working groups at VMware. Okay. So imagine the amount of, and by the way, we had to do these because we were accountable to the board, and she was in that security governance team. So a CISO organization was doing this, but really it applied to every part of the business, right? So there was tens, if not hundreds, of policies, everything from acceptable usage policy to monitoring and observation to identity management, you name it, right? So I asked her, like, how often did you run these things? And so, like, weekly. Every week she had to do this, and it was she was probably the only person who actually read these documents thoroughly, right? Because the people who had to sign off with them, including VPs, obviously they needed to do it, but on hand on heart, if you asked the people who were responsible for that particular domain, they would say to you, "Hey, Abhishek, I need to do this, but I have 10 projects to execute. It's not my top priority." And let's be honest, who's going to read these documents? This is just shelfware. This is just shelfware no one's going to read. I know we have to tick a box here, but I don't. This is now turned on its head because in the world of agentic AI, this is your instruction manual for agents to produce outcomes. It's no longer shelfware. It's weaponized for agents. So, can I give you an example?
Sure. Yeah. I would love to hear an example. Yes.
And this goes back into another passion of mine, which is observability. So, I ran many observability teams, and in that landscape, in that marketplace, there's been plenty of products that have been very, very good at event intelligence. So with event intelligence, they understand service dependency mappings, noise suppression. They can see patterns, recognize patterns, and eventually they can garner insights. And if the pattern recognition is good enough, and they know what's happened in the past, they can say, "Hey, I see you have a problem in your system, and based on this insight and the things you did the last 5 times this happened, I think you need to restart this service." So, lots of products were in this AI ML space with that data, but they were waiting for the agentic revolution to have access to tools to generate outcomes. Right? So it's ripe for this. It's really ripe for this. But the missing piece is, to kind of remove like the human governance of it, is that how is it going to figure out how to fix it? Like, you think about this. It has to check your change management policy. It has to understand what priority of an incident this is, how many customers are affected by it. If it's quarter end, maybe we need humans to make a decision. If it's not, I don't. So if it had knowledge, these policy workings, the standards, the configuration management, the engineering principles, documents that should be the foundation of your knowledge, it is rich data that agents can actually accelerate change on. And I think this is going to get a new renewed focus in the agentic era, to be honest with you. Policies, principles, standards, they really do matter. It turns out, guess what? They really do matter. And by the way, it also turns out your best people should be working on them.
Yeah, I think, Brian, you make an excellent point. Like that's probably like number one checklist before we go about thinking about agents is these policies because agents need guardrails. And the thing is, in the past, you mentioned the thought that was coming to my mind, like who's looking at those policies ever? Is it just basically to cover your ass because you're such a large organization and you have to go through these compliances? It's like startup filling SOC 2 forms. Like, oh, I have a policy, but who is enforcing those policies? Who are looking at those policies? And for the first time ever, we can have continuous monitoring and observability, and agents can actually make decisions or get to a decision and provide enough context. So it reduces the work for the person who is going to make the decision. They may not even know that there's a policy that exists.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? Like I'm thinking of like hundreds of thousands sitting on Confluence or somewhere that people wouldn't know, right?
Oh, for sure. People were making decisions without consulting policies. So you have to admit that agents which can read it instantaneously will have greater accuracy in some cases than human judgment, and we have to train them on that. And I think experiment a little bit on that to see how good the outcomes are over time. But I think the future looks bright for that in that world.
Even if we don't hit this, like kill that process action from an agent right now, at least capturing all that context, like one thing you said, like how many customer would this impact? Most people do not even know that, right? And if we can look at the prior history and bring all that context at the fingertips of people working on your team, and it's like going into the meeting to make that decision that never existed, or it would have taken hours, and then you still miss some, is now on the fingertips because I mean, large organizations have so many systems running that people don't even know because people come and leave, processes keep running, right?
And I'll add one more thought to you before we move on, is that it's no longer an excuse not to have this documentation, right? AI can help you generate it and edit it if you like. You shouldn't do that, but it can. But number two, return to my example of an agent fixing an issue based on an observation from an observability system. If it did action XYZ and it didn't have the outcome we thought it was going to have, the agents themselves can give a loop of feedback to update the policies and the standards and the principles because something was wrong in them. So you have that perfect feedback loop that's going to keep on iterating and improving your knowledge as well. But I genuinely think our human expertise should be involved in this for the foreseeable future, and I think it's definitely a fulfilling role, no matter what area you come from, even if you're a coder and developer or a data scientist.
Yeah, makes sense, Brian. You know what this reminds me as you talk about agents starting with observability and document. It's like a concept from dogfighting. I think we briefly talk about it's called OODA loops. It was invented by this fighter pilot called James Boyd, and it has become basically dominated everything from dogfighting to competition, everything. It's like observe, orient, decide, act, right? And fighter pilots used to make very rapid, quick decisions. Do you think this really fits in?
By the way, I also worked for leaders who were pilots, so we often got like the pilot analogies flowing at the conversation table. There's very good checklists in that domain as well. I like the OODA loop. So we're talking about dogfighting from World War II, I think. Is that right?
It was invented around that time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in many ways, if you flip OODA to the agentic world, what are we fighting? And I think we're fighting, or we're trying to engage in an argument with leadership, or maybe or organizations
yeah.
to establish trust and accuracy.
Yeah.
right? That has to coexist with like our human workforce and our human work frameworks that we currently have in governance. So how do you establish trust and accuracy? I think yes, they have to observe and orient. They have to be, in other words, context aware about. So we mentioned a little bit about process and dependencies earlier. I think a lot of people aren't aware of process and dependencies, by the way. So if you look at an enterprise architecture team, their job is to map out business processes, understand where we're very strong in business capabilities or very weak in areas where we're best class and where we need to be best class. But not even those EA teams probably know every single service dependency from the app layer to the bare metal, right? And I think even more business owners are surprised that, as we mentioned earlier, I didn't realize how complex this particular workflow was. Observability can kind of like shine a light on those black holes and help you stitch it together. But agents need to be like you said, orient and observe. They need to be aware of the process and the dependency mapping, but they also have to have access to that knowledge and policy to gain agencies. Like, what do I need to do to fix this? Do I need a human to approve this, or can I act autonomously? All these things we need to start documenting. We better get it right. So I see that analogy like a kind of a CI/CD kind of process for agents continuously improving. Yeah.
Yeah, and CI/CD is almost like one way. You're just delivering, you're not taking the feedback. But over here, there's like continuous cycle of these OODA loops where, like to what exactly you described earlier on, knowledge management, right? Or when you have an issue, you have a constant feedback loop, and that's what like OODA loops actually do. So very interesting. So, interest of time, Brian, I have quite a few questions. I mean, like, I would love to continue talking, but I do want to have sort of one main question, and then I have a few rapid fire, which I've kept secret. So they'll be interesting.
Okay.
Yeah. So, if you became CIO of a large enterprise tomorrow, and the board said, Brian, we need to drive enterprise value using agents, what would be your first three steps?
I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I have you. The first thing is you have to start with that workforce conversation, and change it maybe from automating everything to I use the word augmentation instead. Have that augmentation mindset um, instead of we're automating away roles, because if you have the hearts and minds, that's important to me as a leader personally, right? But you also have to have this kind of embrace of there's a necessary enterprise wide, I think enterprise wide org change that's coming. But there's also huge new opportunities. How do we kind of fulfill those new opportunities? How do we retrain people? So this is like a cultural thing that needs to happen. Number one. Number two is we touched on it a little bit here, but we could go for much, much longer on it. Double down on that architecture piece and that governance and knowledge management piece, right? But be clever about it, right? If you feel like that you're way behind the curve, or your documentation and knowledge is a decade old, AI can help you catch up pretty quickly, right? And it can accelerate that. It's never too late to run those things in parallel, or even catch up, like we said. And the third thing, which we didn't talk about at all here today, and we need another podcast for, right, is security. And look, the only thing I mentioned earlier was risk, but there is clear risks with agentic proliferation in organizations, right? I think it's counterbalanced with the risk of not doing it. So I am, like I said, I am absolutely for experimentation with agentic AI, but you need to have lockstep understanding of the risks for data privacy. I think a lot of your customers probably, Abhishek, are going to ask you that question about data privacy, right? For themselves and their customers. What are the risks, right, to AI supply chain, for example? There's a lot of bad actors. There's AI being used in malicious ways. Um, Even deep fakes. I mean, how do we know this podcast is real?
No,
Nobody
it's not.
could slice and dice it in the future, and there's nothing we can do about it. So, without going too deep on security, like I said, I think you need another podcast for that. I think a good way of thinking about it is have you seen, what was that movie? iRobot, where they had like law zero for the robot, right? These are the things that you cannot break. And people are doing MCP servers, which is essentially API calls anyway. And I like to think about APIs are these are the rules that we cannot break if these two systems are going to coexist with each other. And I think there needs to be law zero for agents as well. I don't know what that is, right? But I think from a security perspective, yeah, you need to have really good relationships with your CISOs of this world that have enough governance but don't block innovation. And that's a recipe you need to work on getting right. But I think that's probably the three areas I would focus on, the workforce, the architecture and knowledge piece, and security. All those things will help you scale AI, not prevent you. It'll help you scale faster. Yeah.
At this moment, I can think of so many questions, but just interest of time, I would love to know some other side of you other than technology. So these are just quick answers, whatever come to mind quickly. What's the worst advice you have been given?
The worst advice. That's a tough one. I think it would probably I don't like I get why it happens, but I don't like balance of trade conversations that go on in organizations, right? I think as you mature, this is for you scratch my back, I scratch your back, where the advice was given to me is the right thing to do. But I also had some great leaders who mentored me to say, always have your data, always stand behind your data. If somebody higher in the organization says, no, we have to do this, it's the right thing for the business, it very well probably is the right thing for the business, but at least you kept in your integrity and you had your data behind you. So that's one example that comes to mind. I'm not sure if it's a good answer, but
No, it's very interesting. I can dive deeper, and I'm working with large enterprises. I think the complexity and the organizational dynamics can be very, very complex. And I get to learn more and more of these and the kind of decisions we have to make. And that's just real world. It's not a perfect,
it's
bubble
real
that we're
world.
living. Yeah.
Sometimes things are above your pay grade, but I
Yeah.
think even people who disagree with you
Yeah.
appreciate that you have the data to back it up and they understand your point of view. And
Yeah.
it's important to keep your integrity in that regard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And everybody has to pay their mortgage. So, what are
Yeah.
you going to do?
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Second, what's a failure that taught you the most?
Uh, um, no, I think that's an easy one for me because it was the experience is still in my mind. Is that you know when you try to unify standards? I ran a network organization for a while. You have lots of different opinions, and it's very important to have those to come up with the recipe, if you like, for this is going to be our standard for this particular domain or this layer, right? Versus going ahead with because you're under pressure to execute projects and you haven't ratified that standard on lead. My mistake was like maybe I did that initially in my earlier career, but the project ran much more smoother when we had that ratification and unification of standards. As a lesson I learned, and I'm as you can see today, I've been applying some of those lessons in AI orchestration. Maybe I'm wishful thinking, like you said, but I think it's a lesson I learned.
What's the weirdest thing working at the executive level?
The weirdest thing,
Yes.
I think if people um, don't know this instinctively, like most people actually have a kind of a fear of failure. There's nobody who is like perfect, right? Um, there's an underlying fear of that failure, and once you kind of embrace that everybody's actually human and everybody's learning from each other, I think it becomes easier. Um, but some of the best executives I've ever worked with have often taught me, sometimes your harshest critic is the best voice you've ever heard, right? The best piece of advice you've ever heard. Don't be worried that you got criticized this time or you didn't. You got thrown a fastball and you couldn't bat it back. You're going to learn from that experience, and yeah, leadership is quite a human thing, really.
And my final question, Brandon, I keep going. I love the answers you're giving, and I have just so many thoughts on that. And just because of interest of time, I'm trying to not to comment. What's the question do you wish people would ask you?
Well, you are. You're now throwing hard balls at me.
Yeah.
Uh, I honestly don't know like maybe what's it all about, Brian? You know, what's the mysteries of the universe? I like it's I you know what I guess what I don't get asked a lot is like you know where where do you see like uh people's careers going in IT? That's a hard question to answer, but I like thinking about it. And it's one I think about a lot because I have, I've been lucky to have like hundreds of, not, thousands of colleagues I've interacted with over the years who, chat to me all the time and are worried about, is AI going to take this over? Is it going to take that over? And honestly, I don't think anyone knows all the answers to it, but it's a question that like, I think we need to talk about more for sure.
It makes a lot of sense, Brian. And you've spoken like a true leader about people's first. That I think all your answer had people's segment. The first thing you need to think about is people before you start about any agentic process. And
Yeah.
this
Well,
has been a blast.
I'm learning from the best as well.
Yeah.
So some of the best people I worked with were people centric as well. So yeah.
This has been a blast, Brian. I can keep talking for hours, and I think this is already my longest episode so far, and I'm far from done. We'd love to have you again.
Okay.
And have a good night. Talk to you soon.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you, Abhishek. Thank you.
Bye.